G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we are looking at my team selection for race week 5 ahead of the Chinese Grand Prix sprint race weekend. We're back in Shanghai for the first time since 2019, so really looking forward to assessing what my team is looking like ahead of that race weekend. As always, if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Before I take a look at my team selection dilemmas for the Chinese Grand Prix, we'll do a quick recap of how my team performed in Japan. I had 244 points all out, and I have Charles Leclerc for the second race week in a row as my 2x DRS boost driver. He drove exceptionally well after a disappointing qualifying, starting P8 on the grid and came all the way up to P4 on a very different tyre strategy. Just missed out on a podium after being passed by Carlos Sainz in the closing stages, who was on fresher tyres, but a sensational drive again from the Ferrari duo, who have made it very clear to all of us that they are a very strong team and Red Bull's closest rival at this point in the season. The rest of the team, pretty good. Red Bull was probably the biggest surprise for me. I mean, they were expected to do very well at Suzuka. The track suited the car's characteristics, and Max was no doubt looking for a bounce back weekend after not finishing in Australia. He came away with his third win in a row at this circuit, but most interestingly, Red Bull had 108 fantasy points on a non-sprint race weekend. I'll just pull something up for you on the screen here. Data is sourced from f1fantasytools.com. This is the highest in the last 2.5 or since the start of 2022. This is the highest score from any constructor on a non-sprint race weekend, 108 points. So a really impressive result for them. As you can see here, the 4 highest scores are all from sprint race weekends, and we haven't seen a score this high on a non-sprint weekend since Belgium in 2022, where Red Bull came away with 1 point less, 107. But a pretty phenomenal result for them, and they've clearly dominated the fantasy landscape for the constructor since 2022. So another massive boon of points for them, banking all of the fast pit stop points, the fastest lap, and then obviously the 1-2 finish to go with a few overtakes as well, not to mention strong qualifying result on the Saturday. So really perfect weekend for Red Bull across the board, and they're just continuing to go from strength to strength from the data you're seeing on screen here. So exceptional result for them, and the fact that they're able to pull together a record-breaking fantasy performance it goes to show how much value and importance they are to our fantasy teams if you want to climb the ranks. So coming back to how my team did, other than Ferrari, who finished 3-4, and Charles Leclerc, it was a bit of a middling, but still better than average result for most of my team. Haas are just continuing to demonstrate their value. Both drivers under 8.5 million, K-Mag and Hulkenberg, without a DNF, and with the exception of Hulk's race week 1 performance, they've just continued to go up in price every single week. So $500,000 to $1 million increases from these guys is essentially what you're going to get as long as they can finish races. They've demonstrated they are the 6th best car. Their race pace, their tyre degradation, so much improved from where it was at least a year ago. So Ayo Komatsu has done incredible work there in such a short amount of time. Lance Stroll just continuing to deliver, 13 points for him. Another solid result, nothing spectacular. A shame that he missed out on the points, but it really shouldn't be going out in Q1, given the Aston Martin is what's looking to be better than Mercedes at the moment. So 13 points is not bad, and you're going to get value increases from him every week as long as he doesn't do what he did in Saudi Arabia. So at least in terms of value, offering what you expect from him at that price. The only disappointment was Zhou Guanyu. He had that retirement after that mechanical failure. Started P20, so he really set himself up to make a few positions gain, a few overtakes, but unfortunately retired the car. They've had reliability concerns with that wheel nut. Obviously another spanner in the works. Not great for Zhou. So yeah, one driver I'm really not so sure about. Kind of stuck with him the last couple of weeks. Unfortunately, just had to put up with it. But unfortunately, that's how it goes sometimes. But otherwise, pretty sound result. 244 up to 44.6k overall. in the global standings. So continuing to push, would obviously like to be a little higher, but by no means complaining. I think setting up nicely for the sprint races as we approach the first interesting part of the season and what that means for our teams. So this is how I'm shaping up for China. We're returning to a circuit we have not raced at in 5 years. A lot of drivers have only done a couple races, and there are quite a few on the grid that have never raced there. Oscar Piastri, Logan Sargent, Zhou. So all very exciting. Certainly Zhou's home race too. So a lot of pressure on him. But I think there is a little bit of cause for concern. There are people that have talked about using the Limitless chip, and we've got back-to-back sprint race weekends in China and Miami, which certainly opens the door for using a powerful chip like the Limitless. And I will say, approach these sprint races with caution, particularly China, because it is a very valuable chip, and you don't want to obviously put yourself in a position where you've used it and kind of knee-jerk use it. But again, there's also some strategy that goes into it. And before I get into deciding kind of where my team is at and what that means for a kind of chasing more budget gain and points in the next few weeks, I thought I'd tweet this on Limitless and the impact it can have on building your team value and your transfers when you activate the chip. I find it is most valuable and has the most upside on sprint race weekends. There's a case that you can make for Limitless that on weekends, whether it's not a sprint, but off template or off meta teams like Mercedes, like McLaren are looking good, you could potentially use it then. But right now, it's pretty clear cut. The top two teams are Red Bull and Ferrari. For Limitless, as you can see here on the tweet, and feel free to reread it in your own time, if you chose to activate the Limitless chip in China, your Miami team will be what it was in Japan before you make any transfers in Miami. You can make transfers ahead of the Chinese Grand Prix if you were to activate Limitless then, but those trades you make before activating the chip will reverse. And so once you activate the chip in China, you will have your team from Japan as your team in Miami once it unlocks and price changes have gone through. You also cannot roll transfers on a Limitless chip. So the week after you activate the Limitless chip, you will always have 2 free transfers, no matter how much rolling or planning or making transfers before the Limitless chip is activated. You will always have 2 the week following Limitless. And the team you had before activating the Limitless will be the team that experiences the price increases and the price decreases, not the team that you have on Limitless. So just keep that in mind, because that can play a role in determining what your team value is and your transfer strategy heading into those important chip weekends. I will just come back to my team. I wanted to obviously just run that by you guys if you're not familiar with how Limitless works with transfers and price changes. But obviously I've got a team here that I'm pleased with in terms of setting it up for building budget. Zhou, the only driver in my team that went down, but the $0.7 million swing between Zhou's 0.2 drop and Bottas's 0.5 increase has set me back just a little bit. It's quite funny that all you need is one DNF between 2 drivers that you're deciding on, and that can be a massive swing for your team budget and obviously your points in that weekend as well. So this is kind of where my head is at. Now, there's been a lot of chatter around moving from a lineup like this to a Red Bull, Ferrari, Max Verstappen lineup with budget fodder to fill out the rest of the spots. I was talking about this before China, and I do think having Max for these sprint races makes a lot of sense. To get to that, I rolled a transfer to have a bit more flexibility, but because of the Zhou situation, I will have to take a -10 anyway. So that's kind of backfired with the DNF. Obviously, you can't plan for that, and I kind of went in with the lens that Zhou, for me, had a better chance of going up in value than Bottas, just because he qualifies a lot worse, so has a better opportunity to make positions gain and overtakes, or at least I've seen that to be the case this season so far. But unfortunately, that puts me in a sticky situation where I am again having to move around some drivers in my team to get to Max. So I would ultimately put Max in that 2-time slot and then have to fill out the rest of my team with the cheaper assets at the bottom, which even trying to do so, I'll put Zhou back in here. where I had him before. 1, 2, 3 would, even if I got Bottas in, still wouldn't have enough to get to Albon or Sargent. 0.1 short of Sargent. So I guess the dilemma I'm faced with is having to drop Hulkenberg as well. These are two Haas drivers that have just proven that they're going to go up in value most weeks as long as they can get to the end of the race, which they've demonstrated so far this season. And then having to drop in Sargent and Albon. I look at this, I don't love this. I know people ran this most recently in Japan. It came out all right points-wise, even though Zhou and Albon both DNF'd. I just don't love it. Looking at it on face value, you've got two Sauber drivers that have well-documented wheel nut issues. You throw in the reliability concern coming out of Japan with Zhou. Does that continue into China? I don't know. You've got the Williams guys that are not running a spare chassis, so any mistake in practice puts them on the back foot. You've got Sargent, who's an inherent DNF risk on his own, which has been surprising. He's not had a race DNF so far this season. And then Albon's just not looked convincing. Williams just seems a little bit behind the 8 ball at the moment. So I look at this and I'm looking at Max and Red Bull and Ferrari, and I really like that. And then it's just falling off a cliff afterwards. So it definitely feels contrarian of me to suddenly backflip on this decision. And I'm not writing the idea of this lineup off for China, but you're going to a circuit where we've not raced that before. And there just seems to be a lot of risk looking at this lime green and sky blue lineup. So I'm in two minds about it. Minus 10s for a team like this is not the end of the world, but a minus 10, which you've got a lot of risk coming with, does worry me just a little bit. So that's one such option for me. I could activate the no negative at China to hedge that bet, but yeah, that's kind of one such approach I could take. The other is run a pretty similar build to what I had in Japan, to be quite honest. I think they've got the building blocks of a budget building team. I could potentially downgrade Zhou to Bottas, not to chase value per se, but just to simply free up a little bit more cash. Now, had I done this a week ago, Bottas would have been at 5.9 and Zhou would have been at 6.8. So that would have been 0.9. I've really lost out a little bit on the value here with that $0.7 million swing. But having a little bit more budget when I do get to building out a Verstappen lineup, having a bit more flexibility and not having to make trades to downgrade drivers, which are more or less par for one another in Zhou and Bottas, just seems like a mechanism to plan forward if I can. So I could get Bottas in. And then the other driver I've really been eyeing off lately has been Yuki Tsunoda, who drove one of his best races, I honestly think, in recent times in Japan. So he would just make enough room for Magnussen. I don't mind this either. I think you've got Stroll and Tsunoda as two drivers that are hopefully or expectedly going to go up in value. They've both, I think, outperformed fantasy-wise, and you're seeing back-to-back price increases from both of them. Tsunoda's driven very well despite a pretty slow start in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, but he's really coming around, demonstrated he's much better than Ricciardo through 4 races. So this could be another such option for me. An alternative build would be to downgrade Leclerc to Sainz, who has looked definitely the better driver of the two through the first 4 races of the year. That 1.6 would mean I could keep Magnussen over Hulkenberg. I marginally prefer K-Mag just because of his ability to qualify slightly lower than Hulk. Hulk, we know, can get into or close to Q3 a lot of the time, and you want a budget driver that typically goes out in Q1. And K-Mag tends to do that, can also feature in the odd Q2 as well. But I think K-Mag's chances of an early Q1 exit are much higher than Hulk's. So that's why I like his kind of appeal as a fantasy asset. Then I'd bring Tsunoda back in. That would be 3 trades. I could always keep Zhou, but I've got 3 trades. I may as well roll them if I choose not to go down the Verstappen route. Now, I've talked about no negative. I've talked about limitless. I think all of those chips are very viable at China, maybe even autopilot. But that's kind of where my head's at for some combinations at the moment. Do I go with limitless? Probably unlikely if I go with that chip in either Miami or Austria. And I'll cover that a lot more in my chip strategy video as well. But I think my head is very kind of torn as to whether or not I go for a Verstappen, Red Bull, Ferrari, and budget fodder lineup, or I go for something a bit more balanced that tackles a bit more growth. And if I do activate the Limitless in Miami, I will carry forward this budget building team of sorts over that weekend. I'd hopefully get the price rises from these drivers and constructors while I've got Limitless active in Miami, and then I could potentially activate the wild card after the Limitless and get in Max and I guess whoever else makes up the numbers with a little bit of extra budget, assuming everything goes my way. But that's kind of where my head's at. It's also very much in flux. I wouldn't say I have a concrete plan right now. I've got some ideas, but a lot hinges on seeing what results served up to us in FP1 and in the sprint qualifying, because with the sprint race weekends, the deadline is now when the sprint race starts and not when the sprint qualifying starts. So we've got a little bit more information to gather from that extra session, and hopefully by that point I'll have a fair idea of what my team's going to look like for that weekend. But that's kind of my preliminary thoughts right now. Be sure to drop a like on the video. I will be back with my preview and final thoughts video closer to the deadline, but I appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you all very soon.